Okay, today we are going to be looking at 1 Samuel chapters 8 through 12. Chapter 8 begins the second major section of 1 Samuel. We're introduced to a new character, Saul, and we're introduced to a new institution, the Israelite monarchy. While Saul functioned as Israel's first king and military leader, Samuel, we will see, continued to serve as the spiritual leader of the nation. Judges were individually appointed by God, but in chapter 8, verse 1, we find that Samuel actually appointed his sons to assist him in judging cases. Verse 2 tells us they were judges in Beersheba. I'm going to get a map up here to remind us of where we are. You will see here that, getting ahead of myself, Samuel was from Ramah or Ramah, and though there are several places identified by that name, different locations, it was roughly 5 to 15 miles from south of Shiloh. Unfortunately, I couldn't find another map that had Ramah on it that also had the other places that I wanted. But here is Shiloh, and so since Ramah, we find in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1, Ramah was in Ephraim, then Ramah was somewhere between here, Shiloh, and Bethel, roughly in this area. It was about 5 to 10 or 15 miles north of Jerusalem, again, depending on who you ask. Samuel's sons were in Beersheba, which was down here some 50 to 60 miles south of Ramah. And this will be the primary map that we'll be using as we go through this account. Again, Ramah was Samuel's hometown, and apparently it became the city that Samuel now lived in since Shiloh had been destroyed. We talked about that last week. Chapter 8 and verse 4 tells us that all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. And as we've done each week, I will give a pause at the beginning of each section so you can stop the reading if you wish and read that section. This week, each section is a whole chapter. And so the first section is entitled The Request for a King. You can stop the audio or the video at this time and read chapter 8 if you would like to do so. Chapter 8, verses 4 and 5, the elders had come to Samuel at Ramah in order to make him appoint or in order to encourage him, ask him to make or to appoint a king for the nation. And so question number 1 says, what are some contributory factors which might help explain Israel's request? Why did they ask for a king? And it gives us chapter 12, verses 6 through 13. That passage tells of Samuel reminding the people of their history. And their history had consisted of being troubled by opposing nations, and then the people of God crying out to God for help, and God responding by raising up a deliverer, a leader of some kind. And so when we get to question 11, which talks about, on your paper, question 11, talks about chapter 12, verse 12, and it makes it clear that their initial request for a king was based on an imminent threat from the Ammonites. And we'll make that connection more clearly when we get there. Question number 2 says, what reasons did the elders of Israel give for wanting a king? Well, they mentioned 3 things in verse 5. First of all, they mentioned that Samuel was old and would not be able to continue his leadership role for very long. Then they mentioned that Samuel's sons did not walk in his ways. They were corrupt, and the people didn't want them to lead their nation. And then third, they mentioned they wanted a king to judge them like all the nations. Again, there's another point made a little later. Let me stop a second. Question number 3 says, since several passages show that a king was not necessarily inconsistent with God's plan for Israel, what made Israel's request for a king sinful? That's a good question. The passages that were listed with that question, address God anticipating the day that Israel would have a king. And he actually gave them instructions about what kind of king to select. And so he was not condemning Israel for in the future for having a king. In fact, the first passage listed, Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 20, anticipates the very words used in this passage in Judges chapter 8. I'll just read verses 14 and 15. It says, "When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, here it is, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us." Verse 15 begins, "Then be sure," God says, "to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses." Well, that's interesting because here in Judges chapter 8 in verse 7, God said they've rejected me that I should not reign over them. But also in Deuteronomy 17 verses 14 through 20, God emphasized that the kind of king that they should have rule over them was one whose focus should be on righteousness. Well, they seemed to focus on that and make that a priority in chapter 8 of verse 5 of Judges, when they were concerned because Samuel's sons did not walk in Samuel's ways. That is, they didn't live righteously. So they asked what God had anticipated them asking. They wanted the kind of people, apparently, or person, leader that God was encouraging them to want. So what was the problem? Well, it seems to me that the problem is found in verse 20. After Samuel told the people all the things that God would do, which will be answered in question number 4, we're told, Samuel told the people all the things the king would do, which will be answered in question number 4. We're told that the people said, "We will have a king over us that we may also be like all the nations." Here it is. "And that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." That seems to be the crux of it. This point is brought up again in chapter 12 with another element to it. So they wanted a king who would judge us and go out before them and fight their battles. God had demonstrated on many previous occasions throughout their history that he would fight their battles for them. In fact, not many years earlier, in chapter 7 and verse 10, the Lord gave Israel a stunning victory over the Philistines. Israel did not need a king to go out before them and fight their battles. But they were choosing a fallible human leader over God. They were putting their trust in a king instead of putting their trust in God. Question number 4 asks, what does Samuel tell the people they could expect in a king? Well, chapter 8, verses 11 through 17 mentions broadly 5 things. First, the king would draft their young men to serve in the military, to farm his fields, and to prepare for war. Second, the king would draft their young women to work in his palace and serve in his court. Third, a king would tax the people's crops and flocks. Fourth, the king would appropriate the servants of the Israelites and their finest young men and donkeys. Citizens would be forced into the king's service. And fifth, the king would take away the people's personal freedom. Section 2 is called The Meeting of Samuel and Saul. And you can pause to read chapter 9 at this point. Question number 5 says, relate the circumstances that brought Samuel and Saul together. Just a second here. Saul's father, Kish, is called a man of mighty power, chapter 9, verse 1. This seems to refer to a wealthy landowner and possibly a leader in time of war. Some of his donkeys had been lost, and he sent Saul with a servant to find them. And after searching a lot of territory, Saul decided they needed to go back home. Let me point out some geography here at this time. Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin. And let me go to the next map here. He's actually from Gibeah. This is Benjamin. Here's Shiloh again. Here's Ephraim, which is where Samuel is from. Ramah is somewhere in this vicinity. And so here's Saul's home place. We're also going to come into contact with Mizpah in a little bit. And Saul goes looking for the donkeys, and it mentions him going through the mountains of Ephraim, so he's in this general area. And we're going to see that he ends up coming to Ramah and encountering Samuel there. I'll go back to this one. This is the general area of Benjamin here. Gibeah is roughly here. Ramah is roughly in this area. So Saul has been sent to find his father's donkeys, and they decide they need to go back home. And it's interesting, at this time we're introduced to several very positive traits about Saul. In verse 5 of chapter 9, he expresses concern that his family might become worried about him. He shows a sense of responsibility and sensitivity to the needs of others. Then a little bit later, well, in verse 6, the very next verse, when his servant suggests that they go into the city to inquire from a man of God, in verse 7, Saul suggested that they needed to bring a gift. This is another admirable trait. The servant has some money, and so they enter the city where they meet Samuel. And again, this city would have been Ramah, Samuel's hometown. And question number 6 asks, how did Samuel know that Saul was the man God selected to be king? Well, that's easy. Verse 17 tells us that the Lord spoke to Samuel and said, there he is. The Lord had already made this clear to Samuel previously. And then when Saul shows up in the town, the Lord says to him, there he is, the man of whom I spoke to you. This one shall reign over my people. So Samuel invites Saul to the feast and makes it clear that he had already set aside food for his special guest, that he had been anticipating him. And then we see that Saul spends the night at Samuel's house and leaves the next morning. Third section is entitled The Appointment of Saul. I'll give you a few moments here. You can pause and read chapter 10. Question number 7 asks, what 3 signs were given to Saul to remove any doubts that his appointment was from God? Verse 2 says that he would meet 2 men by Rachel's tomb, and they would tell him that his father's donkeys had been found. Verses 3 and 4, Samuel told Saul that he would meet 3 men going to worship at Bethel. He said they would greet him and give him 2 loaves of bread. The third sign would be when Saul came to the Philistine garrison. He was told that he would meet a group of prophets, and the Spirit would come upon Saul, and he would prophesy also. Question number 8 says, since verses 20 and 21 evidently refer to the casting of lots, and since Saul had already been selected and appointed, his public selection by lot may appear to have been a risky undertaking, but was it? Well, we first note that he says evidently it refers to casting of lots. The text actually does not say they cast lots. Most people believe that's what they did, and it likely is, but apparently some method of selection was used, whatever it was. But of course it was not risky because God had already selected Saul, and God was the one in control of the lots or whatever method they were using to make the choice. Question number 9 asks, how was Saul received by the people? Verse 24 indicates that most of the people were excited and they yelled, long live the king. However, verse 27 says that some rebels said, how can this man save us? So they despised him and brought him no presents. But we're told that Saul kept silent. Like the results of any election or any choosing, some people are elated and some people are deflated. But we're going to see in chapter 11 that that's about to change. And so the next section is called the Battle at Jabesh Gilead. And this covers chapter 11. And I'll give you a moment to pause here. Question number 10 asks, what had Israel expected a king to do for them? See chapter 8, verses 19 through 20. We referred to this text earlier, and in the latter part of verse 20, which is what I understand to be what he's referring to here, the people said they wanted a king to go out before them and fight their battles. And question number 11 asks, what was the occasion of the war with the Ammonites? Well, there's a footnote in the New International Version based on a Masoretic text found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which indicates that there was a previous situation with the Ammonites that prompted them to behave this way, to come up on Jabesh Gilead and make the threat and offer the terms of peace or subjugation. But let me refer to the map here. This is Jabesh Gilead again. Here's Benjamin. Here's Gibeah, roughly Ramah, Shiloh, which is no longer an issue. I keep referring to it because it has played into the account in the first several chapters. But here's Jabesh Gilead right on the west side of the Jordan River, Dead Sea, Sea of Galilee up north. This is the Ammonites here. And so they've come up against Jabesh Gilead and they've made this threat. And so they encamped against Jabesh Gilead. And this was obviously a threat of war. And the people of Jabesh Gilead tried to make a peace treaty, but the Ammonites said they would make a treaty based on the condition that the men put out their right eyes. Men of Jabesh Gilead requested 7 days to find out if anyone would come to their aid, and if no one did so, they would do what was asked of them. Apparently, the Ammonites preferred a treaty over battle, so they agreed to this. The second part of question 11 says, considering chapter 12, verse 12, I alluded to this earlier, explain how the Ammonite threat was related to the request for a king. Well, in chapter 12, verse 12, Samuel says to the people, when you saw that Nahash, king of the Ammonites, came against you, you said to me, no, but a king shall reign over us when the Lord your God was your king. Well, that request for a king, that they wanted a king to reign over them, that request was back in chapter 8, verse 5. Nahash the Ammonite didn't come up against Jabesh Gilead until chapter 11 and verse 1. And Saul had already been proclaimed king at that time. This seems to make it clear that Nahash the Ammonite had been a threat to Israel earlier. It's just not mentioned until chapter 11 and verse 1. This threat from the Ammonites was apparently the reason they requested a king to begin with. Question number 12 says, what had Saul done after his appointment as king? Verses 4 and 5 says, when the messengers came to Gibeah, and there's a reference again to Saul's hometown here, Gibeah. And so this threat comes from up north, from Jabesh Gilead, and it finds its way down south to where Saul is, because of course he is again the anointed king. He's been proclaimed king. It says, when the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and reported these terms to the people, they all wept aloud. Just then Saul was returning from the fields behind his oxen, and he asked, what is wrong with everyone? Why are they weeping? And they repeated to him what the men of Jabesh had said. So the answer to the question, what had Saul done after his appointment as king, it seems that he apparently just continued farming and whatever else he did in his civilian life. Question number 13 asks, how did Saul gather an army? Well, verses 6 and 7 address that. It says, when Saul heard their words, the Spirit of God came powerfully upon him, and he burned with anger. He took a pair of oxen, gathered them into pieces, and sent the pieces by messengers throughout Israel, proclaiming, this is what will be done to the oxen of anyone who does not follow Saul and Samuel. Then the terror of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out together as one. Question number 14 asks, what was the result of Saul's victory? Well, some people wanted to put to death the rebels who had complained about Saul in chapter 10, verse 27. But led by Samuel, the people went to Gilgal, and that's over here on the east side of west side. Did I say this was the west side? That's the east side of the Jordan River, Jabesh Gilead. And Gilgal was right here on the west side of the Jordan River. So Samuel leads the people there to Gilgal to reaffirm Saul's kingship. And the last sentence in chapter 11 says, there they made sacrifices of peace offerings before the Lord, and there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. Now chapter 12 is a continuation. Seems to be a continuation. Samuel stands up before the people and makes some comments. And so this last section is called the renewal of the kingdom at Gilgal. And I'll pause here so you can read chapter 12. Question number 15 says, what is the main point of verses 1 through 5, then 6 through 12, then 13 through 15? The point of verses 1 through 5 are to establish the fact that Samuel had ruled with integrity. Samuel's past record was established to inspire confidence in his present exhortation. Why would they have confidence in what he had to say now if they believed he had lived without integrity in the preceding years? What were the points? What was the point of verses 6 through 12? Well, this was to rehearse Israel's history of falling away from God and being subjugated by other nations. It was to warn them against repeating this behavior. The point of verses 13 through 15 were to encourage them to fear God and to warn them again against turning away from God. Question number 16 asks, how was the truth of Samuel's message confirmed? Verses 16 through 18 says, Now Samuel said to them, Now then, stand still and see this great thing the Lord is about to do before your eyes. Is it not the wheat harvest now? Is it not wheat harvest now? I will call on the Lord to send thunder and rain, and you will realize what an evil thing you did in the eyes of the Lord when you asked for a king. Then Samuel called on the Lord, and that same day the Lord sent thunder and rain, so all the people stood in awe of the Lord and of Samuel. The wheat harvest was in the summer months. The land of Israel receives its rainfall during the winter season. For it to rain during the wheat harvest would obviously be very unusual, plus it rained upon Samuel's request. Question number 17, what is the main point of verses 19 through 25? Well, Samuel assured them that he would continue to teach them the good and right way. He assured them that God would be with them as long as they remained faithful to him. And he warned them that if they behaved wickedly, they would be swept away, both them and their king. Our next class will cover chapters 13, 14, and 15. These chapters will show the disobedience and the decline of Saul, and chapter 15 tells of Saul being rejected by God as king, though he will continue to occupy the throne. The emphasis of these chapters will be on obedience.